You're here because you want to get a solid handle on um, a really crucial time in American history, the 1920s, and that slide into the Great Depression.
Yeah.
You want to understand the political shifts, the
Yeah.
sort of big ideas floating around, and those early shaky signs in the economy, but without getting buried in tons of facts.
Right. Cut through the noise.
That's exactly what we're aiming for today. We've got a really compelling set of sources lined up, everything from election details to deep dives on economic policies, even some firsthand stuff, all to give you a clear, insightful view of this pivotal time.
And what's really revealing, I think, is how World War I acted as this major turning point. It really shifted the American political landscape in, well, pretty significant ways.
Yeah.
The 1920 election is just a perfect example of this.
Okay, let's dig into that 1920 election then.
Yeah.
So the Republicans nominated Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge. Harding's big promise was a return to normalcy. Now, for folks listening, what was the core appeal of this normalcy idea back then?
Well, normalcy really tapped into this widespread feeling, this yearning for stability. People wanted to step back from all the intense international stuff and the reforms of the progressive era and the war years.
They were just worn out.
Exactly. People were just weary of constant change, constant sacrifice. Harding's landslide win wasn't just a leadership change. It really signaled a fundamental shift in the national mood, a decisive turn away from Wilson's internationalism.
Absolutely. Sounds like a kind of national exhale, you know?
Yeah.
And on the Democratic side, you had James M. Cox, who was pushing for the League of Nations, with pretty unknown Franklin Delano Roosevelt as his running mate. Quite a contrast in vision, wasn't it?
Oh, definitely. Cox was arguing for, continued American engagement on the world stage. But the election results, they were pretty definitive. A sweeping win for Harding.
Like 404 electoral votes to Cox's 127.
Right. And a big lead in the popular vote, too.
16 million for Harding versus 9 million for Cox. Those numbers really hammer home the public feeling. And, we should remember this was the very first national election where women across the country had the vote.
Right.
That must have had a considerable impact.
Oh, for sure. It expanded the electorate significantly.
Yeah.
And, we also shouldn't forget Eugene V. Debs, the socialist candidate. He got a surprisingly large number of votes, over 900,000, even though he was in prison at the time.
Wow.
Harding actually pardoned him later, which is kind of an interesting side note.
It really is. So the main takeaway from this election seems to be this strong public desire for change. And like you said, many saw Harding's win as a flat-out rejection of the League of Nations, a move towards more isolationist policies.
That's certainly the prevailing isolationist interpretation, yeah. And this shift, you saw it domestically too, like the dismantling of the War Industries Board, that was a real setback for progressives hoping for, ongoing government oversight of big business.
Right, the whole idea of government taking a more hands-off approach to the
Yeah.
economy. And then you had things like the as Cummins Transportation Act, returning railroads to private ownership.
Mm-hmm.
That feels like another step away from those earlier progressive ideas, especially when you think about the old populist push for nationalizing the railroads.
Exactly. And the act actually committed the Interstate Commerce Commission to ensuring railroad profitability, a far cry from government ownership. At the same time, though, there was some serious domestic unrest bubbling up.
Yeah.
The migration of Black Americans to northern cities during the war, unfortunately, it sparked a series of really violent race riots.
The Chicago race riots in 1919 were particularly awful, weren't they? Like dozens killed, hundreds injured.
Yeah, terrible figures. 23 Black and 15 white people dead, around 500 wounded, 1,000 families homeless. And that wasn't the only one. It just shows the deep racial tensions simmering.
And amidst all this and the soldiers coming home, the government set up the Veterans Bureau in 21, and the American Legion got started in 19.
And what's notable about the American Legion, right from the start, it became this really strong voice for conservative, patriotic, and distinctly anti-radical views. They lobbied hard for veterans' benefits.
Okay.
And we can't forget the Red Scare either, 1919, 1920, targeting suspected radicals in unions. It just further underlines that conservative mood settling over the nation.
Okay, so we've got this clear shift in the political climate. Now let's get into the Harding administration itself, which, well, to put it delicately, it got tied up with some major corruption. The Ohio gang or poker habit, what exactly was going on there?
Well, Harding basically surrounded himself with his buddies, his close friends from Ohio, and a lot of them just didn't have the experience or, frankly, the integrity for the high-level jobs they got.
So this Ohio gang.
Yeah, it essentially became this hotbed of corruption. These guys were using their government connections for, personal enrichment.
And the sheer scale of some of these scandals is just,
Yeah.
wow. You had Carl Charles R. Forbes at the Veterans Bureau essentially looting, what, an estimated $200 million?
Yeah. An immense amount of money back then, just staggering.
Yeah.
And Forbes eventually went to prison for it, which really brought the issue of government corruption right into the spotlight. But maybe the most infamous scandal is Teapot Dome. Can you walk us through the key bits of that one?
Sure. So, 1921, Albert Fall, Harding's Secretary of the Interior, he manages to get control of these valuable naval oil reserves. Teapot Dome in Wyoming,
Yeah.
Elk Hills in California.
Right.
And President Harding, maybe surprisingly, signs this secret order transferring them from the Navy to Fall's Interior Department. Fall then turns around and leases these oil-rich lands to a couple of private oil men.
And gets a hefty payoff.
Exactly, a bribe of around $400,000.
Right.
And, Teapot Dome wasn't just about one guy being corrupt. It really exposed this deep cynicism and just hammered public trust in government.
Oh.
There was that saying at the time, right? In America, everyone is assumed guilty until proven rich.
Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is the timeline. It started coming out in 23, indictments in 24, but the whole thing dragged on legally until 1929. Fall eventually did a year in prison, but the oil men who bribed him, they actually got acquitted on the bribery charges.
Which really says something maybe about the legal system or the influence of money back then.
It certainly raises questions, and Teapot Dome wasn't like a one-off incident, was it? Attorney General Harry Daugherty, he faced some serious accusations too.
Yeah, Daugherty was investigated for allegedly selling pardons and liquor permits illegally. He ended up being forced to resign.
Right, and faced 2 trials, but both ended with hung juries. And the fact that several of his close advisors apparently committed suicide rather than face the potential fallout, it just underscores how pervasive the corruption seemed to be in that administration.
It paints a pretty bleak picture of how things were run. And then right in the middle of all this mess, Harding suddenly dies in August 1923.
Yeah.
And it's significant that the full scope of these scandals wasn't even public knowledge yet.
That's right. Vice President Calvin Coolidge takes over. But, it's worth pointing out, despite all the corruption, Harding's cabinet did have some really capable people.
Like who?
Charles Evans Hughes, Andrew Mellon, Herbert Hoover, figures who would definitely play big roles later on.
Ah, right. Influential names. Speaking of them, let's talk about Harding's and then Coolidge's and Hoover's conservative economic agenda. The basic idea seemed to be that policies helping business would, eventually help everyone.
Precisely. The dominant thinking was that government's main job was to boost business profitability. This led straight to trickle-down economics, a theory strongly pushed by Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon.
And trickle down basically meant cutting taxes for corporations and the wealthy, right? With the idea that they'd invest more and that would grow the economy for everybody.
Yeah.
Mellon was a big fan of those tax cuts through the 20s.
Yeah, they rolled them out in stages 21 to 26. But the consequence was a pretty noticeable shift in the tax burden, more of it falling onto the middle class. Another key part of this economic plan was higher tariffs, most notably the Fordney-McCumber Tariff Act in 1922. This was pure economic protectionism.
This tariff raised import duties quite a bit, trying to field American industries from European competition. But it sounds like this policy had some negative side effects.
Oh, it definitely did. It actually hampered Europe's post-war recovery, made it harder for them to repay their war debts to the U.S.
Okay.
And in response, European nations slapped their own retaliatory tariffs on American goods, which then hurt American manufacturers.
Yeah.
It basically created this damaging cycle of global protectionism.
And beyond tariffs and tax cuts, there was this strong push for laissez-faire minimal government meddling in the economy.
Exactly. Harding put people in charge of regulatory agencies who were often pretty lukewarm, even hostile to the regulations they were supposed to enforce.
Right.
Antitrust laws often got downplayed. And Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover actually encouraged industries to form trade associations, basically promoting consolidation. His rationale was eliminating cutthroat competition, but it raised concerns about monopolies.
So the government wasn't just stepping back, it was actively kind of helping big business grow and consolidate. And this thinking extended to the idea that businessmen were the best people to run the government.
Absolutely. Cabinet posts were often filled with wealthy business leaders. And this philosophy also meant rejecting federal programs designed to directly help ordinary citizens.
Like with the Mississippi flood victims.
Yeah. The administration argued against direct federal aid, emphasizing local charity instead. It really shows that conservative belief system. And of course, it foreshadowed Hoover's own approach later during the Depression.
And Harding cemented this conservative direction by appointing 4 conservative justices to the Supreme Court. That had a lasting impact, didn't it? Especially on reforms.
Definitely. The Adkins v. Children's Hospital case in 1923 is a perfect example. It struck down a minimum wage law for women,
On what grounds?
basically arguing that since women now had the vote, they didn't need special protection in the workplace anymore. It shows the court's impact on labor and women's rights.
Wow. Okay. And the administration wasn't exactly friendly towards labor unions either, was it?
Not at all. Union membership actually dropped significantly during the decade. The big 1922 railway strike is a key moment. Attorney General Dougherty got this sweeping legal injunction against the strikers, really underscoring the government siding with business over organized labor.
It paints a really clear picture. A government largely aligned with big business interests. But you mentioned Andrew Mellon earlier. They did manage to cut the national debt, right?
Yes, that's one area they pointed to as success. Secretary Mellon, through the new Bureau of the Budget, did oversee a significant reduction in the national debt by about $10 billion.
So it seems like a time of real contrast. You've got major scandals and corruption, but also this clear conservative economic direction and success in cutting the debt. Now let's switch gears to foreign policy in the 1920s. The big theme seems to be isolationism, right?
That's certainly the dominant historical view, yeah. The U.S. refusing to join the League of Nations or ratify the Treaty of Versailles really set the stage.
And some historians argue that decision actually weakened the League and maybe even contributed to World War II down the line.
That's a major argument, yes, that the absence of the U.S. hampered collective security efforts.
And it wasn't just the League. The U.S. also said no to a security treaty with France. Our sources suggest that might have unintentionally pushed both France and Germany towards rearming. It's such a complex web.
It really is. Congress even had to pass a special resolution in July 21 just to officially declare WWI over for the U.S.
Right.
And the Senate refused to join the World Court, the League's judicial branch, which just further cemented that isolationist stance.
But there were some exceptions, weren't there? Some moments of international engagement. The Washington Disarmament Conference comes to mind. That seems pretty significant.
Yes, that was a major effort, led by Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes. The main goals were trying to head off a growing naval arms race among the big powers and stabilize things in the Far East.
And the old Anglo-Japanese alliance was a concern too.
Exactly. It was seen as potentially destabilizing.
So the conference led to some key treaties. The Five-Power Treaty seems like the biggest one. What did that do?
Basically, it set specific ratios for battleship tonnage. The U.S. and Britain got a ratio of 5, Japan got 3, and Italy and France each got 1.75.
Okay.
Now, in exchange for Japan accepting a lower ratio, the U.S. and Britain promised not to build up fortifications in their Far East territories, like the Philippines. The irony, though, is that Hughes didn't quite realize this effectively gave Japan naval dominance in the Western Pacific.
Huh. An unintended consequence.
Definitely. The treaty also put a 10-year freeze on building new battleships. So while it aimed for peace, it had these loopholes and side effects that, limited how effective it really was and arguably favored some powers over others.
So a step towards limiting navies,
Yeah.
but with some serious strings attached. And there were other treaties from that Washington conference too.
Yeah, the Four-Power Treaty replaced the Anglo-Japanese alliance. Britain, Japan, France, and the U.S. agreed to respect each other's Pacific possessions and consult if there was a threat. And the Nine-Power Treaty of 1922 tried to uphold the open-door policy in China, guaranteeing equal trade access for everyone. But, again, these treaties had their limits.
More loopholes. Like what?
Well, no restrictions on smaller warships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines. So other nations started building those up while the U.S. kind of fell behind. And the U.S. Senate attached reservations to the Four-Power Treaty, basically saying the U.S. wasn't obligated to use force to uphold it, which pretty much made it ineffective.
So paper tigers, in a way. And meanwhile, the U.S. was still intervening in the Caribbean and Central America, despite this broader isolationist feeling.
Yeah, that continued. Troops came out of the Dominican Republic in 24, but they stayed in Haiti until 34, and Nicaragua. That's a really long and tangled story.
U.S. forces went in and out, right?
Yeah.
And eventually put Somoza in power.
Exactly. Anastasio Somoza, whose family then ruled Nicaragua all the way until 1979. The situation with Mexico over oil fields also shows the complexity. Coolidge tried a more diplomatic route with Ambassador Dwight Morrow, but it still caused resentment in Mexico.
But the rhetoric started to change a bit, didn't it? with the Clark Memorandum in 1928.
Yes, Secretary of State J. Reuben Clark issued this statement saying the U.S. wouldn't intervene in Latin America just to protect U.S. property anymore. It was basically rejecting the old Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine.
Okay, let's shift to that really tricky issue of loans and reparations after World War I. The U.S. came out as a major creditor nation, right?
Yeah.
And started demanding repayment from its European allies.
And that caused a lot of resentment in Europe. The British and French felt it was unfair, given their massive sacrifices during the war. They argued the U.S. should maybe write off the loans as part of the shared cost of winning.
They also pointed out that their spending in the U.S. boosted the American economy, right?
Exactly. And they said the high U.S. tariffs made it almost impossible for them to earn the dollars they needed to pay the U.S. back.
It's a classic tangle of global economics and different national viewpoints. And the Allies, meanwhile, were demanding huge reparations from Germany to pay their own debts to the U.S.
Right. France even occupied Germany's Ruhr Valley in 23 when payments lagged, which led to hyperinflation in Germany. Just a mess.
And President Coolidge wouldn't budge on canceling the debts.
Nope, firm refusal. This eventually led to the Dawes Plan in 1924.
Which was an attempt to, reschedule Germany's payments and get American private loans flowing to Germany?
Basically, yeah. It created this kind of circular flow of money. American banks loaned money to Germany,
Germany used that to pay reparations to France and Britain.
who then used that money to pay back their war debts to the U.S. Treasury.
Wow. That sounds fragile.
It worked for a while, but it was totally unsustainable. It all came crashing down with the stock market crash in 29. And like we said, these policies really created a lot of bad feelings toward the U.S. and Europe.
And finally, on foreign policy, there was the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, outlawing war. That sounds incredibly optimistic.
It really does. 62 nations signed it, declaring war illegal as a tool of national policy, except for self-defense.
Ah, the loophole.
A big one. How do you define self-defense? And crucially, there was no enforcement mechanism at all. It basically gave Americans this false sense of security, even as things were getting tense internationally.
So despite some efforts like the Washington Conference and maybe a rhetorical shift on Latin America, the 1920s foreign policy was mostly isolationist. And many historians argue that stance had big, negative long-term consequences for peace.
Yeah. And our sources really emphasize that the Great Depression itself became a huge factor in why peace eventually failed, along with that lingering war psychosis in Europe from WWI.
Okay, let's pivot now to the economy itself and the road that led straight to the Great Depression. We've touched on some underlying problems. Coolidge's presidency mostly continued Harding's conservative policies, but one huge, persistent issue was the farm crisis.
Absolutely. Even while cities seemed prosperous in the 20s, the agricultural sector was really hurting. European farms recovered after the war, so demand for American farm goods dropped. And at the same time, American farmers were producing more than ever thanks to new machinery like the gasoline tractor. More supply, less demand. Prices just plummeted.
We're talking a serious agricultural depression all through the 1920s. Something like a quarter of all farms sold off because of debt or taxes.
That's the figure, yeah. It was brutal. And there were attempts to fix it, like the McNary-Haugen bill. It actually had bipartisan support from farm states.
What did that bill try to do?
Well, it was proposed several times between 24 and 28. The idea was for the government to buy up surplus crops to keep domestic prices high and then sell the surplus overseas. Farmers would pay a special tax to cover any losses.
It's plausible.
But President Coolidge vetoed it twice. He felt it was improper government interference. So farm prices stayed low, and that definitely played into the politics of the 1924 election.
Speaking of 1924, it's interesting that the progressive movement wasn't completely dead. Robert, fighting Bob LaFollette, ran as a third-party candidate.
He did. Nominated by a revived progressive party, got endorsements from the AFL and even the socialists. His platform was pretty radical for the time. Government ownership of railroads, major farm relief, attacking monopolies.
And limiting the Supreme Court's power.
Yeah, a constitutional amendment to limit judicial review. A direct challenge to the court. But in the end, Coolidge won easily. It suggests that for most people, the feeling of national prosperity limited the appeal of radical reform.
And this tension between private business and potential government action also played out with mussel shoals.
Right.
On the Tennessee River.
Exactly. The government built a dam and nitrate plants there during WWI for defense. Senator George Norris really pushed for the government to keep owning it and develop hydroelectric power.
But Harding and Coolidge were against it.
Yeah, they saw it as socialistic, too much government involvement. It really highlighted that fundamental disagreement about the government's role in the economy. And of course, Muscle Shoals later became the core of the TVA during the New Deal.
Then came 1928, the election pitting Herbert Hoover against Alfred E. Smith. Hoover ran on keeping prosperity going and kind of strangely keeping prohibition.
Yeah.
Smith, on the other hand, faced a lot of prejudice, didn't he? Because he was Catholic, urban, from an immigrant background.
Absolutely. And that campaign was the first where radio played a really big role. Hoover talked up rugged individualism, warned about socialism. Smith, sadly, faced a ton of religious bigotry.
And Hoover won big.
Landslide victory. It seemed like the public still had faith in Republican economic policies. And then, just months after Hoover took office, the stock market crashed. October 1929.
The bull market of the 20s just seemed unstoppable, didn't it? Fueled by all that speculation, people buying stocks on margin.
Yeah, buying with borrowed money, which magnifies gains, but also magnifies losses hugely.
And it all came crashing down on Black Tuesday, October 29th.
Yep, massive sell-off, stock values just evaporated, billions lost in weeks. Now, the traditional story is the crash caused the Great Depression, but our sources suggest it's maybe more complicated. Well, a major depression didn't immediately hit right after the crash. It suggests there were other, deeper economic problems already there that the crash just sort of exposed or triggered.
And the effects of the Depression were just catastrophic. Bank failures everywhere, businesses collapsing, unemployment hit, 25% by 1932?
At least 25%, higher in some cities, and that doesn't even count struggling farmers. The human cost was immense.
Yeah.
Wages just tanked, farm foreclosures spiked, people lost their homes, their savings, their sense of self-worth, families broke up, marriage and birth rates dropped. These shanty towns, Hoovervilles, sprang up everywhere, millions homeless, malnutrition was widespread.
And the U.S. Depression was worse, lasted longer than in many other industrial nations?
Much worse in terms of the drop in production, yeah. The whole international system of reparations and war debts just fell apart. U.S. exports dried up.
So the crash was dramatic, but the Depression had these much deeper roots. Our sources point to weaknesses like declining industries, overproduction without enough consumer demand.
Yeah, underconsumption, really.
And that incredibly uneven distribution of income as major long-term causes.
That's right. Industries like cotton, railroads, they were already struggling. Manufacturers cranked out goods all through the 20s, but workers' wages and farm income just didn't keep up. So people couldn't buy all the stuff being made. Warehouses were full.
And too much wealth was concentrated at the very top.
Exactly. A huge chunk of the population lived below the poverty line. Add to that an unstable banking system mismanagement, too much speculation, and a weak international economy, made worse by protectionist tariffs like Hawley-Smoot in 1930.
That was the one with the highest tariffs ever.
Highest in U.S. history, yeah. It triggered retaliatory tariffs from like 23 other countries. All these factors combined to make the crisis so deep and so long-lasting.
And Hoover's response to this unprecedented disaster was shaped by his belief that the causes were mainly external European, right? And his reluctance for big government action domestically.
Initially, yes. He did try some things. For farming, the Agricultural Marketing Act and the Federal Farm Board tried to help through cooperatives, buying surpluses. But it wasn't enough to combat the overproduction.
And the Hawley-Smoot tariff just made things worse for farmers and trade.
Right. He also really pushed volunteerism, asking businesses not to cut wages or lay people off, promoting private charity. But it quickly became obvious that voluntary efforts just couldn't cope with a crisis this massive.
He did eventually approve some public works, didn't he? Like the Hoover Dam.
Yes, that started under him. And he set up the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC, in 1932. That provided government loans to banks, insurance companies, railroads, trying to shore up the system.
And later he gave some relief funds to states?
A little, yes. But the RFC was often criticized as relief for the rich, helping big institutions more than ordinary people. And Hoover strongly opposed direct federal relief payments to individuals. That was against his rugged individualism philosophy.
There were some legislative things, though, like the Norris LaGuardia Anti-Injunction Act.
Yes, that helped labor unions by limiting federal court injunctions against strikes and outlawing those yellow dog contracts that forced workers to promise not to join a union.
And Hoover tried a moratorium on international debts in 1931.
He did, but the global economy was already too far gone for it to have much effect. And then came that really damaging episode with the Bonus Army.
Yeah, the World War I veterans marching on Washington.
Thousands of them, desperate, asking for early payment of the bonuses they'd been promised. The Senate rejected it, and then Hoover ordered the army to clear out the veterans who remained camped out.
And it got violent.
It did. Images of the U.S. Army driving out veterans, burning their camps. It looked terrible. It really hurt Hoover politically, made him seem disconnected from the suffering.
So looking back at Hoover,
Well, he did oversee more government intervention than any president before him. You could argue he maybe prevented an even worse collapse, and some of his actions, like the RFC, kind of paved the way for the New Deal. But ultimately, his conservative beliefs really limited his response.
and while all this economic chaos was happening at home, Hoover also faced a dangerous world stage, especially with Japan becoming more aggressive.
Right. The Japanese invasion of Manchuria in September 1931. A clear violation of treaties slammed the open door shut in that part of China.
And the League of Nations condemned it.
They did, but Japan just walked out of the league. Hoover, reflecting that strong isolationist mood in the U.S., wasn't willing to even consider military action, and that really handicapped the League's ability to do anything effective.
Which led to the Hoover-Stimson Doctrine.
Yeah, basically saying the U.S. wouldn't recognize any territory taken by force. It was a moral stand, but it had no teeth. Japan just ignored it and bombed Shanghai. Many historians see this failure to check Japanese aggression as one of the first steps towards World War II. On a slightly more positive note, Hoover did try to improve relations with Latin America through the Good Neighbor policy, moving away from interventionism.
Did the Depression help with that, ironically? Less U.S. economic muscle to throw around.
That played a part, yes. Less economic imperialism. Treaties were set up to withdraw troops from Haiti later, and forces did leave Nicaragua early in '33.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, the 1920s and the start of the Depression really emerge as this time of huge consequential shifts. We saw that decisive move to political conservatism after the war and progressive era.
Driven by that desire for stability.
Yeah. But underneath that surface prosperity, you had these major economic weaknesses brewing in farming, the huge wealth gap. Then the crash exposed it all, plunging the country into this terrible depression. And the initial government responses were just, well, limited by that prevailing conservative thinking.
And what's really striking is how interconnected it all was, isn't it? The isolationist foreign policy had these unintended global effects. The conservative economic policies aimed at helping business maybe ended up contributing to the imbalances that made the Depression so bad.
Yeah.
It really highlights how complex governing is and how actions can have unforeseen consequences.
Absolutely. For me, one of the biggest takeaways is just how deep the roots of the Depression were, planted right there in the seemingly booming 20s. That massive inequality, the wild speculation. They were like fault lines waiting to break. It really makes you think about, the cycles of booms and busts and how important government's role might be in maybe regulating markets, trying for a fairer distribution of wealth.
Which leads to a really vital question for you, our listener, to think about. Looking back at the lessons from this critical time, what parallels, if any, do you see in the challenges and opportunities we face today? How might understanding the choices made back in the 1920s inform how we tackle the complexities of our own era? It's definitely a lot to mull over.